Titanis Prime was no ordinary battlefield. It was the crown jewel of gladiatorial combat in the galaxy, where warriors from countless worlds fought to entertain bloodthirsty spectators. The Colosseum itself stretched beyond the horizon, its walls forged from the wreckage of fallen warships, its sands soaked with the blood of champions long forgotten. Thousands of alien species gathered in the stands, their voices blending into a deafening roar as another fight was about to begin. Sarah Carter stood at the center of the arena, a lone human amidst towering extraterrestrials. The air was thick with jeers and laughter. To them, she was a joke, a frail, unimpressive creature from a backwater planet with no business being in the most feared battleground in the galaxy. Her opponent, Zorlac, loomed over her, an 8-foot brute covered in chitinous plates, with 4 arms bulging with muscle. His tusked face twisted into a grin as he observed the human woman before him. "You are the best they could find?" Zorlac boomed, spreading his arms theatrically to the audience. The crowd erupted in laughter, pounding the metal railings in amusement. Sarah didn't flinch. She had heard worse before, from drill sergeants who made Zorlac look like a motivational speaker. Her gaze remained steady, her posture relaxed but coiled with potential energy. She let them laugh. They wouldn't be laughing for long. Zorlac enjoyed playing with his prey. He strutted across the sand, throwing mock punches at the air, flexing his 4 massive arms. He turned to the crowd, feigning boredom, covering his mouth in an exaggerated yawn. They ate it up, hooting and hollering, placing bets on how quickly he would end the fight. Sarah remained still, studying him. The way he moved, the arrogance in his posture, he had never faced a true fight. He was used to overwhelming strength winning the day, but brute force had its flaws. The moment he underestimated her, he was finished. The announcer's voice thundered across the arena, crackling through hidden speakers. "Warriors of Titanis Prime! Today, we witness a battle of legends. The undefeated champion, Zorlac the Ravager, faces, well, a human. May the gods have mercy on her." More laughter. More jeers. The alien overlords who controlled these battles had forced her into this fight, assuming she would die spectacularly. The spectacle was all that mattered to them. But they had miscalculated. The signal to fight blared across the stadium, and in an instant, Zorlac lunged, his massive battle-axe whistling through the air. It was an attack meant to end things quickly, one colossal swing, powerful enough to cleave through stone. But it never met its target. Sarah was gone before the blade reached her. Zorlac's axe slammed into the sand with a deafening crash, sending a shockwave through the arena floor. The impact alone should have knocked any opponent off balance, but Sarah had already sidestepped, her movement fluid, almost casual. Zorlac's grin faltered. The crowd's laughter died down. No one had expected her to dodge. She was supposed to be crushed, bleeding, or at the very least scrambling to recover. Instead, she was standing a few paces away, unscathed, watching Zorlac with an expression that was almost amused. Zorlac turned slowly, his tusks twitching in irritation. He hadn't even considered the possibility that she could evade him. Now, he had to reconsider. And for the first time, he realized something unnerving. Sarah hadn't drawn a weapon. Not yet. Zorlac's confidence wavered as he stared at the human before him. The fight should have been over the moment his axe met flesh, but instead, he had struck only air. And still, Sarah had not drawn a weapon. The crowd murmured, the initial laughter fading into puzzled whispers. The human was fast, unnervingly so. But without a weapon, speed would only delay the inevitable. Zorlac knew this, and so did the spectators. "Are you going to fight, little human?" Zorlac called out, gripping the hilt of his axe, wrenching it free from the sand. His 4 arms flexed as he rolled his shoulders. "Or are you only here to run?" Sarah exhaled slowly, then reached for the small, cylindrical object strapped to her back. A flick of her wrist, and the blade extended, humming softly with a glow that sent an eerie shimmer across the sand. The stadium fell into absolute silence. It was no ordinary sword. Its edge pulsed with an almost liquid-like energy, a shifting hue that defied physics. The weapon was impossibly thin, Yet every alien in the audience recognized its significance. Some had only heard rumors of such a blade, a technology so advanced it was said to cut through any known material. Others had seen it in action during wars that reshaped entire star systems. Zorlac took an involuntary step back. His expression darkened. Sarah twirled the blade once, testing its weight. She could feel the hum resonate in her fingers, a familiar vibration she had grown accustomed to after years of wielding it. Unlike Zorlac, she had been in real fights. And real fights weren't about theatrics or brute strength. They were about precision. Zorlac roared and lunged again, swinging his axe in a downward arc meant to split her in two. But the moment steel met energy, the impossible happened. His axe split apart like butter, the blade falling in two separate pieces at his feet. The audience gasped. Zorlac stared at his ruined weapon, disbelief twisting his face. The laughter from earlier was completely gone now. For the first time in his career, Zorlac was unarmed. The murmurs in the crowd swelled, rising into frantic speculation. This fight was no longer a joke, it was something new, something unpredictable. The announcer, who had been preparing an over-the-top eulogy for Sarah, stammered into his microphone. It appears our challenger has a rather, unique weapon. This match is far from over, ladies and gentlemen. Sarah allowed herself a small smirk. The tides had shifted, and she could feel the weight of thousands of eyes watching her differently now. She wasn't prey anymore. Zorlac clenched his fists, the veins in his massive arms bulging as he processed what had just happened. Then, slowly, a different expression took over, one that sent a ripple of unease through the audience. He was smiling. Zorlac let out a deep, rumbling laugh, shaking his head. I see now, he said, flexing his hands. This is going to be fun. His entire stance changed. Gone was the arrogance, the theatrical bravado. He crouched slightly, his muscles tightening, his eyes locked onto Sarah with renewed focus. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't expected in this arena: excitement. With no weapon, Zorlac relied on the one thing that had never failed him: raw, unrelenting power. He surged forward, fists flying, his speed shocking for a creature of his size. Sarah barely ducked in time, the wind from his punch whipping past her face. His second strike came immediately, a follow-up from his lower arms, but she twisted away, narrowly avoiding the crushing impact. The ground where his fists landed cracked violently. The audience was on their feet now, their previous amusement completely forgotten. This wasn't just a spectacle anymore. This was real. Sarah kept her breathing steady, her mind sharp. Zorlac was faster than she had expected, but that didn't change the outcome. Strength meant nothing if it couldn't land a hit. She darted to the side, positioning herself at his blind spot. One precise movement was all it took. Her blade flashed through the air, meeting his exposed side. A thin line appeared across Zorlac's armor. Then, a moment later, deep crimson blood seeped through the cut. Zorlac stumbled back, stunned. A hush fell over the arena. It had happened. Sarah Carter had drawn first blood. For the first time in his life, Zorlac knew what it felt like to be wounded in combat. He pressed a hand to his side, staring at the dark blood on his palm, his expression unreadable. Then, instead of rage, he let out another booming laugh. He lifted his head, his tusked grin wide. You are worthy. Sarah adjusted her grip on the blade. Took you long enough to figure that out. Zorlac cracked his knuckles, the energy in the arena shifting once more. The fight was no longer about dominance. Now, it was about honor. Zorlac's laughter echoed through the arena, a deep, rumbling sound that sent a chill through the audience. It wasn't the mocking kind they had heard earlier, it was something far more dangerous. It was the laughter of a warrior who had just found a real challenge. Sarah stood her ground, her blade still humming with energy, her breath steady. She had expected him to react with rage, to charge at her recklessly in a blind attempt to reclaim his pride. But no, Zorlac was smarter than that. He wasn't just some brute swinging a weapon mindlessly. Which meant the fight was far from over. Zorlac flexed his four massive arms, rolling his shoulders as if warming up for the real battle to begin. His tusked grin was sharp and hungry. "You are fast," he admitted, his voice thick with amusement. "And that blade of yours, impressive." He cracked his knuckles, sending small vibrations through the sand beneath him. "But speed will not save you forever." Sarah smirked. "It doesn't have to." And then he moved. For a creature of his size, Zorlac was shockingly quick. He closed the distance in less than a second, throwing a barrage of strikes at Sarah with his 4 powerful fists. She barely dodged the first, ducked under the second, twisted out of the way of the third, but the fourth grazed her ribs, sending a jolt of pain through her side. She stumbled slightly but recovered fast, leaping back before he could press the attack. The hit wasn't enough to take her down, but it was enough to make her realize one thing: if even a glancing blow from him hurt that much, a full-force strike would end her instantly. Zorlac didn't let up. He was relentless, keeping the pressure on, his attacks flowing seamlessly from one to the next. He fought like a storm, each punch carrying the force of a battering ram. But Sarah was no stranger to fighting against larger, stronger opponents. She was trained for this. Her footwork became sharper, her dodges tighter. She didn't just evade, she predicted. Every move Zorlac made, she was already adjusting for the next. And as the minutes dragged on, something became clear to everyone watching. She wasn't just surviving. She was controlling the fight. The crowd had started the match as her enemy, jeering and mocking her. Now they were leaning forward, watching with a mix of awe and disbelief. The human who was supposed to be crushed within seconds was holding her own against the undefeated champion. Then, finally, she saw an opening. Zorlac overcommitted on a punch, his forward momentum making him slightly unbalanced. Sarah didn't hesitate. She darted in, blade flashing. A sharp line of red appeared across his side. Zorlac let out a grunt, stepping back instinctively. He looked down at the wound, pressing a hand against it. Blood coated his fingers. For a moment, silence. Then, the arena exploded. Some spectators roared in approval, others in disbelief. Bets were being adjusted mid-fight. The announcer, who had been prepared to deliver another mocking remark, fumbled with his words. Sarah didn't waste time celebrating. She had made her mark, but the fight wasn't over. Zorlac looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he let out a booming laugh. "You are the first to wound me in this arena," he said, his eyes burning with something new, respect. Sarah lifted her blade slightly, her stance unwavering. "And I'm not done yet." Zorlac grinned, wiping the blood from his side. "Good." Then he attacked again. But this time, there was no arrogance in his movements. No wasted flourishes. He fought like a warrior who had finally found someone worthy of his strength. Sarah met him head-on, dodging when she could, countering when the moment was right. It was no longer predator versus prey. It was two equals locked in battle. The crowd no longer cared about species, no longer cared about expectations. They only cared about the fight. And what a fight it was! For the first time in Titani's Prime's history, the human was no longer the joke. She was the spectacle. Zorlac's grin remained, but his breathing was heavier now. Blood trickled down his side, a sharp contrast against his dark, armored skin. He had fought countless warriors in this arena, monsters, machines, things that barely resembled lifeforms, and yet, it was the human before him who had pushed him to his limits. Sarah didn't let her guard down. She could feel the sweat on her brow, the ache in her muscles from dodging his relentless attacks. The blade in her hand was still steady, still humming with power, but she knew she couldn't keep this up forever. Speed had carried her this far, but Zorlac was adapting. He stopped pacing and tilted his head, as if studying her anew. Then, he took a deep breath. And through sand. Sarah barely had time to react before the fine, stinging grains filled her vision. Her instincts screamed at her to move, but the sudden blindness threw her off. She stumbled back, trying to blink away the grit, and that half-second of hesitation was all Zorlac needed. A crushing force wrapped around her, lifting her off the ground. The crowd erupted as Zorlac's four massive arms locked around Sarah, pinning her in a grip as unbreakable as iron. He had her. The moment his arms closed in, Sarah felt her ribs compress. The pressure was unbearable, like being caught in the jaws of a vice. Zorlac wasn't trying to punch her anymore, he was trying to break her. She gritted her teeth, forcing her mind to work past the pain. She had seconds before he squeezed the air from her lungs. Sarah did the only thing she could, she activated the energy shield built into her combat suit. A pulse of electric blue light burst from her body, forcing Zorlac to loosen his grip just enough for her to slip free. She dropped to the sand coughing, her vision still blurry, but she didn't stop moving. She twisted as she landed, using the momentum to bring her blade up in a precise, devastating arc. The tip of her sword found its mark, slicing deep into Zorlac's shoulder. The champion let out a bellow of pain, stumbling back, his upper left arm now nearly useless. The crowd gasped, some rising from their seats in shock. Sarah pushed herself up, chest heaving, knowing she had just changed the course of the fight. Zorlac was wounded, badly this time. For the first time in his career, he looked uncertain. But only for a moment. Zorlac exhaled heavily, pressing his lower right hand to the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. His tusks curled slightly, a grimace mixed with admiration. Clever, he admitted. Painful, but clever. Sarah's grip tightened around her blade, but she said nothing. She was running on adrenaline now, her body screaming at her to stop, but she couldn't. Not yet. Zorlac straightened, rolling his massive shoulders, but he didn't attack. He simply stared at her, something unreadable in his expression. Then, he did something unexpected. He dropped to one knee. The stadium fell into absolute silence. This was not the posture of defeat. It was a warrior's surrender, a gesture of respect in the traditions of Titani's prime. Sarah knew what this meant. She had won. But the rules of the Colosseum were absolute, victory required a kill. The announcer's voice cracked through the silence, slightly hesitant. Gladiator Sarah Carter, you may claim your final strike. Sarah looked down at Zorlac. He didn't flinch, didn't beg for mercy. He simply met her gaze, waiting. She raised her sword. And then she lowered it. The gasps from the audience were almost louder than their cheers had been. She had refused the kill. Zorlac's brows raised, but slowly he smiled. He let out a deep, approving chuckle. Interesting. The silence stretched on for several long, tense moments before the entire arena erupted into chaos. Some spectators screamed in outrage, demanding tradition be upheld. Others roared in approval, having just witnessed something no one had ever dared to do in Titani's prime. Sarah stood still, letting the weight of her decision settle over her. She had changed the game. Whether for better or worse, she had yet to find out. The crowd had never been so divided. The moment Sarah lowered her blade, a ripple of disbelief spread through the Colosseum. Some roared in anger, demanding blood. Others, the ones who had come to appreciate the unexpected battle, cheered wildly, recognizing the shift that had just taken place. No one had ever refused a finishing blow before. The announcer hesitated, his usual theatrics faltering. Gladiator Carter has chosen mercy? His voice carried uncertainty, as though he himself wasn't sure what to say. This is unprecedented. Sarah stood her ground, blade still in hand, unwavering as she stared at Zorlac. He remained kneeling, his breathing slow, his massive chest rising and falling. But his expression was not one of humiliation. It was one of understanding. With a slow, deliberate movement, Zorlac pressed a hand to his wounded shoulder before slamming his fist into the ground in a gesture of submission. The force of it sent a small tremor through the arena floor. The crowd fell silent again. Zorlac turned his gaze upward to Sarah and spoke, his deep voice carrying across the stunned arena. You fight with honor, he said. More than I have seen in any warrior here. Sarah exhaled, lowering her sword completely. Honor has nothing to do with it, she said. I don't kill for sport. A slow grin spread across Zorlac's face. Then you don't belong in Titani's prime. Sarah felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. He wasn't mocking her. He was right. The overlords who controlled the Colosseum would not be pleased. The crowd might have been split, but the ones who wanted blood would not let this go unanswered. And yet, the moment stretched longer than she expected. No immediate verdict was delivered. The arena's overseers were likely scrambling, debating how to handle what had just happened. A warrior refusing to kill. A champion accepting defeat without shame. The very foundation of the gladiatorial games had been challenged. The announcer's voice crackled again, unsure, hesitant. By the laws of Titani's prime, a victor must be named. A pause. And then, with an almost reluctant tone, Sarah Carter is the winner. The arena exploded into chaos once more. Cheers, boos, outrage. Some pounded their fists against the metal railings, demanding justice for the tradition that had just been broken. Others chanted her name, recognizing her defiance as something greater than a mere fight. But Sarah wasn't thinking about the crowd. She was watching Zorlac as he slowly rose to his feet, towering over her once again. He smirked. I have never lost before. Sarah tilted her head. Then maybe you should get used to it. Zorlac laughed, a deep, genuine sound, before he extended his hand to her. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before gripping his forearm, and he did the same, locking their arms in the traditional warrior's handshake. The gesture sent another shockwave through the audience. This had never happened before. Zorlac leaned in slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. You may have won, but they will not let you walk away so easily. Sarah glanced toward the high balconies where the Colosseum's overlords sat in the shadows, unseen but ever present. He was right. She had disrupted the game. And those in charge never liked losing control. The murmurs among the elites stretched too long. The decision wasn't instant, which meant they were weighing their options. If they declared her victory invalid, the crowd might riot. If they ordered her execution, Zorlac's fans, who now saw her as his equal, might revolt. And then, a new voice boomed over the speakers, one Sarah had not yet heard. Sarah Carter. It was cold, measured, filled with authority. One of the overlords. You have defied tradition. You have upset the balance of Titani's prime. She tensed. Here it was. But, the voice continued, you have also given us something we have not seen in years, a true fight. A pause. By the ruling of the Colosseum, you are no longer bound as a gladiator. You are free. Silence. Then, the entire Colosseum erupted, this time not in rage or confusion, but in sheer, unfiltered shock. Zorlac huffed out something between a scoff and a laugh. Ha! Didn't expect that. Neither did she. She looked up toward the dark balcony, half expecting a trick, a catch, anything. But none came. The overlords could not afford to kill her now. Not after this. She had become more than just a fighter in the Colosseum. She had become a story. And stories were dangerous. She sheathed her blade, turning back to Zorlac. He studied her for a moment, then gave her a small nod. I would fight you again, he admitted. Sarah smirked. I'll think about it. And with that, she turned and walked out of the arena, through the gates she had never expected to leave as a free woman. As the doors closed behind her, the chants of her name followed, echoing through the halls of Titani's prime. The human who had defied the Colosseum. The legend had begun.